Coming up,
we have not been listening.
Girl interrupted, a man strolls up on Greta Tanberg, demanding she stop talking about the Palestinian cause.
I've come here for a climate demonstration, not a political view.
The World Wildlife Fund flags a disturbing development at a plastic summit in Kenya.
Yes, plastic more life.
And we look at the tremendous power of trees, and whether they can save us from the global crisis.
This is one thing that humans seem to have forgotten. Nature is all about balance.
This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World.
The fallen seeds have come to us, fertilizing not so much. I'm gonna brush it off.
The Amazon forest stores about 123 billion metric tons of carbon. It's more than 3 times as much humans emitted last year in 2022. But consecutive droughts are chipping away at rainforest's ability to absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. Drought conditions in the region have been reaching extreme levels since September. Rivers have been drying up, local food supplies are being threatened, and key fish species are struggling to lay eggs. Making matters worse are deforestation and wildfires, which have turned the eastern flank of the Amazon into a carbon emitter. Scientists warn we are at a tipping point that could transform the lives of people in the region. And global forests, including the Amazon, store an estimated 861 billion metric tons of carbon. According to the World Resources Institute, that's the same as 100 years' worth of global fossil fuel emissions at the current rate. But a new study published in the environmental journal Nature uses data from satellites to learn more about the human impact on forest carbon stocks. I spoke to Lidong, a leading author of the study and a doctoral candidate of the Crotho Lab at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. How important are trees to creating the equilibrium that existed before the industrial era?
I would say this is one thing that humans seem to have forgotten. Nature is all about balance. Here I would refer to forests rather than trees. Forests played a crucial role in maintaining ecological balance before the industry era. They acted as key participants in global carbon cycles, regulating the climate. Additionally, forests harbored biodiversity, providing habitats for numerous species and maintaining ecological balance. The widespread deforestation and habitat loss that accompanied industrialization disrupted this balance, leading to increased carbon emission and biodiversity loss. That's why it's crucial to protect the remaining forests, especially in areas like Amazon and Congo and so on. Furthermore, we have to be cautious as removing existing forests or planting forests in unsuitable ecosystems further degrades this broken balance.
How many trees would need to be restored? And how did your team come up with the figure 226 gigatons of carbon that could be captured if we restore the world's forests?
This study focuses not on the number of trees for restoration, but on the potential carbon sequestration from conserving and restoring global forest ecosystems. Responsible restoration should prioritize nature's protection for its regeneration, rather than only counting trees. This situation offers a chance to reshape global restoration disclosure. It's not about creating large plantations to carbon offsetting, to use tree planting to justify not reducing emissions or disrupting other important ecosystems like grassland and wetlands.
So your study says protecting existing forests isn't the only fix and that we need to grow trees too?
I would say the average forest on our planet is degraded, and the average forest is at 30% of its full maturity. If we protect them, sustainably manage them, allow them to reach full maturity, then we can capture a huge amount of carbon. That is why the majority, 61% of the global carbon potential is found in areas that have forests already. That is where the majority of the carbon drawn down comes from. The remaining 39% can be achieved by reconnecting fragmented landscapes through community-driven ecosystem restoration and management. There are all regions with minimum human footprints outside of urban and agricultural land. And these are regions where sustainable agroforestry, rewilding, ecotourism, and thousands of other solutions can be used to help nature recover for the well-being of local people. Overall, we can only achieve this target if people and nature thrive together.
And considering global heating today is a direct result of decades of carbon releasing, and considering there are no real signs we'll stop burning fossil fuels anytime soon, what kind of work would need to be done to protect the planet?
The majority of the global carbon potential is found in areas that contains forests already, where the conservation of nature would lead to significant gains in carbon storages as those forests recover to maturity. The remaining 39% can be achieved by reconnecting fragmented landscapes through community-driven ecosystem restoration and management. These are all regions with minimum human footprint outside of urban and agricultural land. And these are regions where sustainable agroforestry, rewilding, ecotourism, and thousands of other solutions can help nature recover for the well-being of local people.
Climate activists rallied in Amsterdam in mid-November to call out the Dutch government's support of the oil and gas industry. But protesters who were there to criticize the more than $40 billion in annual subsidies to the dirty energy sector got a little more than they bargained for. It began as an ordinary day in environmentalism for Greta Tanberg,
Our future is a right, fight, fight, fight.
the celebrity face of a tens of thousands strong march, this one in the Netherlands. And as is usually the case at these types of rallies, Greta had something to say.
We are destabilizing the biosphere and the very systems we depend on to survive as a civilization. We are not standing on the brink of a catastrophe, we are living in it. People on the front lines of the climate crisis have been experiencing the first-hand consequences of it for decades now, and they have been sounding the alarm, but we have not been listening.
But this march was different. Donned in a scarf expressing solidarity with the Palestinian call for an end to the Israeli occupation, the 20-year-old drew a connection between liberty and global warming.
As a climate justice movement, we have to listen to the voices of those who are being oppressed and those who are fighting for freedom and for justice.
But as Greta veered away from her usual messaging, she was approached.
I've come here for a climate demonstration, not a political tour.
A scary tackle for the mic with an unidentified man.
This is climate demonstration.
Calm down. Calm down.
While people at the demonstration criticized the man, some took aim at Greta on social media. Most notably from the German climate justice movement, Fridays for Future, which Greta represents, they quickly distanced themselves from their biggest champion. In a series of tweets saying, "We stand up for the protection of Jewish life here and everywhere. We've suspended the processes involving international networking. Greta Tanberg is currently hurting a lot of people with her positioning." Ask Greta and her fellow activists if they care.
For climate justice on occupied land.
These environmentalists' reactions come as Israeli attacks on Gaza worsen the enclave's climate vulnerability. As the Palestinian death toll rises above 11,000, those who remain are increasingly exposed to drought, water and food shortages, reduced agriculture, and an increase in harmful insects and parasites, according to the UN.
It's almost too late. We have a choice to do something now, and it has more urgency than it has ever had before.
Climate protests don't usually share the spotlight with other causes, but this one suggests a multifaceted approach environmentalists may be adopting to tackle the crisis. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee held a plastic pollution summit in Kenya between November 13th and the 19th, the INC3 as it's called.
Less plastic, more life. Less plastic, more life.
The 7 days of negotiations centered on the havoc plastic pollution is causing the planet. With 8 million tons of plastic dumped into the oceans annually and marine ecosystems impacted significantly, this form of pollution is a big issue.
To deal with plastic pollution, humanity must change. We must change the way we consume, the way we produce, and how we dispose our waste. This is the reality of our world. Change is inevitable. This treaty, this instrument that we are working on is the first domino in this change.
The World Wildlife Fund contacted us at Just 2 Degrees to talk about an interesting development at the conference. I chatted with the WWF's Global Plastics Policy Lead, Eirik Lindebjerg. What exactly is it at the INC3 talks in Kenya that has the WWF so concerned?
So we are concerned that a group of countries have been trying to backtrack and delay the negotiations by not accepting the zero draft that was really presented as and based on the suggestions from all countries throughout this process. They're not accepting that as the basis for discussions going forward.
The country you're speaking about specifically is Iran, whose demands seem to mean a shift in responsibility from plastic producers to consumers. But is that such a bad thing? I mean, it seems as consumers we have the power to control, in theory, production of plastic.
Yes, I think what is important is to regulate plastic pollution throughout the entire life cycle. We all have a responsibility. So we need to put the right rules and regulations. That means that we must include production, we must include consumption, and we must include also waste management. And we're seeing really a majority of the states in this process supporting that type of agreement, that we all have to put in place rules and regulations for all parts of the plastic life cycle.
Eirik, before we continue, just go into a bit of detail in terms of what Iran is proposing exactly.
So they're proposing to take out production of the scope of the agreement, even though the resolution that started these talks said that we will end plastic pollution across the entire life cycle. And they have deployed then some delaying tactics in these negotiations by not accepting the draft as the basis for negotiations. However, these efforts have not succeeded. The group actually moved into contact discussions and we got to progress. So now actually all countries will come together to start discussing the real content and the substance of this agreement. And that is due to a wide range of governments from all regions of the world actually really supporting progress towards legally binding global rules.
And of course, there's an interesting similarity in terms of these countries that Iran wants to be part of its global coalition for plastic sustainability. What is that similarity, Eirik? And do you think Iran will get the coalition at once?
What the coalition is currently is a small group, handful of countries that are fossil fuel and plastic producers. However, it's not all fossil fuel and plastic producers. There are also other big plastic producers who are willing to at a much higher pace. So that's interesting to note. It's clear that the countries part of this coalition would have an interest, an economic interest in a continued unregulated acceleration of plastic production. However, that same increase and that acceleration that is projected over the next decades is really what is really worrying also environmentalists and others, because that will create huge impacts, not only on the environment, but also on human health and livelihoods.
Dengue, a disease transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, is spreading into the winter time, with hospitals in Bangladesh struggling to make space for a rapid increase in cases. The disease is usually prevalent in the summer. Experts say warmer weather is to blame.
Break bone fever, dandy fever, the 7-day fever. All names for dengue fever, a tropical disease known for fever, headaches, vomiting, severe muscle spasms, and joint pain, and in the worst cases, bleeding to death. Professor Kabirul Bashar, an entomologist, is studying the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes behind one of the worst outbreaks he's ever seen in Bangladesh.
এবছর গ্রামেও ডেঙ্গু হচ্ছে। আমাদের আসলে একটি গবেষণা করা দরকার, আমাদের জানা দরকার গ্রামে যে মশাটি এডিস অ্যালবোপিক্টাস আছে সেই মশাটি কি গ্রামে ডেঙ্গু ছড়াচ্ছে নাকি গ্রামে শহরের যে এডিস ইজিপ্টাই সেটি তার অবস্থান তৈরি করেছে।
There's no vaccine or cure for dengue. The World Health Organization reports 1 in 20 who are infected die. In the last 23 years, Bangladesh has seen 850 people die of the disease. But it killed more than 1,400 and infected nearly 290,000 in 2023 alone. And that number is rising. A major driver of the spread is more mosquitoes.
তাপমাত্রা, আর্দ্রতা, বৃষ্টিপাত এর প্যাটার্ন কিন্তু চেঞ্জ হয়েছে। এখন অক্টোবর মাসের মাঝামাঝি সময়, এই সময় আমরা যে বৃষ্টিপাত দেখছি বর্ষাকালের মতো। এটি তো একটি জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনের ফলেই এই যে সিজনাল প্যাটার্নের চেঞ্জ এটি ঘটেছে। আর যখনই মৌসুম পরিবর্তন হয়েছে, মৌসুম পরিবর্তন হওয়ার সঙ্গে সঙ্গে এডিস মশার যে উপযোগী বৃষ্টিপাত, উপযোগী তাপমাত্রা, উপযোগী আর্দ্রতা আমরা কিন্তু এখন এডিস মশা পেয়ে যাচ্ছে। যখনই এই মৌসুমটি পরিবর্তিত হচ্ছে, এডিস মশা তার পরিবর্তন করছে, অ্যাডাপ্টেশন চেঞ্জ হচ্ছে, এই বৃষ্টিপাতের ফলে বিভিন্ন জায়গায় পানি জমা হচ্ছে, সেখানে এডিস মশার প্রজনন হচ্ছে, ডিম পাড়ছে এবং বংশবৃদ্ধি হয়ে তার ঘনত্ব অনেক বেড়ে যাচ্ছে।
Professor Bashar says the nation's dengue outbreak was confined to Dhaka city between 2000 and 2018. 2019 saw it spread to different cities, and now it's spread to the countryside.
দুটি ভুল ধারণা আমাদের মধ্যে আছে। একটি হচ্ছে এডিস মশা শুধুমাত্র দিনে কামড়ায় আর এডিস মশা পরিষ্কার পানিতে হয়। এই দুটি আমরা দীর্ঘ 3 বছর গবেষণা করে দেখেছি। এডিস মশা দিনে এবং রাতে উভয় সময় কামড়ায়। আর এডিস মশা শুধুমাত্র পরিষ্কার পানিতে নয়, নোংরা পানি, সোয়ারেজের পানি, ইভেন সমুদ্রের নোনা পানিতেও এর প্রজনন হতে পারে এবং জীবনচক্র সম্পন্ন করতে পারে। ইতিমধ্যে এটি আমাদের বিভিন্ন কনফারেন্স জার্নালে প্রকাশিত হয়েছে আমাদের তথ্যটি।
He says a lack of prevention measures led to the increase in cases, and the public must take part in getting rid of mosquito nesting sites to make a difference. Sarah Balter, Just 2 Degrees.
Myanmar's inland lake has been a tourist hotspot for decades, with its crystal clear waters gilded with Buddha statues and lush gardens. The lake is also a vital source of fresh water in the country and designated a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Now, locals say it's degrading, and visitors are drying up too.
In the Shan Hills, south of Myanmar, therein lies the famed Inle Lake, perched with floating farms, houses on stilts, and leg-rowing fishermen. The region relies on visitors for its economy, but there are hardly any tourists here, owing first to the COVID pandemic, then the violence that followed the military coup 2 years ago. But the crystal clear water of the Inle Lake is getting muddied on a different front.
You know,
Between 1992 and 2009, floating farms increased by 500%. And the boom put tomato cultivators at odds with the fishermen who rely on the lake. When tomato farms rot, farmers build new ones, leaving the spoiled vegetation to clog up the lakeshore. Local authorities have attempted to coalesce discarded matter into designated areas, but don't have the resources to manage it. Farmers like Nyant Win deny responsibility for polluting the lake, instead blaming soil flows from slash-and-burn agriculture. Fishermen blame the ever-expanding floating farms on chemical runoff into the waters. A UN report from 2017 gives weight to that argument. It found chemical fertilizers and pesticides are polluting the lake and damaging the surrounding ecosystem. A conservation law for Inle was proposed by the region's parliament in 2019, but has not gained momentum beyond a draft stage. But without its tourist draw cards, the region's economy is struggling.
အဲ့တိုရစ်စီလုပ်ငန်းကပိတ်ထားတာဟိုဖိုလင်နာမရောက်တာ3နှစ်လောက်ရှိသွားပြီဆိုတော့ဒီကြားထဲမှာကျွန်တော်ဟိုဘယ်လိုပြောမှာဘယ်လိုမျိုးလေခုပြည်တွင်းခီးသွားဧည့်သည်လောက်ပဲမိခိုနေရတဲ့သဘောမှာရှိရဗျ
Inle once drew around 200,000 foreigners and 1 million locals a year. But it's unlikely foreigners will return to the lake anytime soon. In March, 30 people were killed when sheltering at a monastery just 2 hours from the site. The local junta and armed groups traded blame for the massacre. And in the first 2 weeks in November, clashes continued, further denting the prospect of tourists returning to the famed site. Mikhail Malik, Just 2 Degrees.
Well, every year, 54 billion kilograms of food are wasted in the United States. That's the equivalent of 130 billion meals and more than $408 billion in food thrown out each year. What's ironic is the more than 40 million Americans, 12% of the population, who rely on food stamps. Polling indicates a majority of Americans recognize this issue. Experts say to address it, there must be a renewed focus on consumer education, portion control, and policy advocacy.
Food waste is definitely a continuing issue in the United States. About 1/3 of all food that's produced is actually never eaten. Nobody actually eats that food. And if you take that a step deeper, what that means is that roughly that 1,250 calories of food per person per day that isn't eaten takes up about 30 million acres of land. And if you think further about that, that means all the pesticides, all the irrigation water, all the fertilizer that goes on that land is also going to food that is never eaten. Most of that is largely landfilled, and so about 20% of all material in our landfills is wasted food. Americans are somewhat aware of the food waste issue. Surveys suggest anywhere from about half to 75% recognize it as an issue. A recent work that we've done in the fall of 2022 suggests that about 2/3 of actually trying to take steps, small and large, to reduce food waste in their own lives. So there is some growing awareness of food waste as an issue. The circumstances that lead to the amount of food that we waste, yeah, it varies on a lot in the context that we are in. So when we're in home, that's where most of the food waste in the United States happens, but that's also where most of the food is consumed. We do have means to deal with that because versus going to a restaurant where you're given a fixed portion size, or your kids who are in a school lunch setting where they're given a fixed portion size, we have the means to alter that food portion size that we eat, and so we can reduce the amount of food waste through that. Also, if places like public schools allow for some autonomy to change your portion size, for example, schools that allow students to have milk dispensers rather than giving them a full carton of milk report wasting significantly less milk than those who kind of give the student an entire carton of milk. Food waste for consumers, I think the big issue here is that they can make big differences in food waste in the United States, and that's pretty important on several reasons. As we've talked about before, about 1/3 of all food that goes uneaten. If we can drive that amount down even by half, what that does is it reduces the price of food for everyone.
Well, the World Bank estimates the financial burden of biodiversity loss amounts to $2.7 trillion a year by 2030. And at the 30th Asia-Pacific Economic Forum held in San Francisco in mid-November, university leaders put a spotlight on the impact of biodiversity loss on land and sea habitats. Academic leaders say if left unaddressed, it's poised to do real damage to the world economy and threatens to upend food and water systems globally. Well, it's the first of its kind. The Caribbean island of Dominica is creating a marine protected area for the mighty but endangered sperm whale. Almost 800 square kilometers of ocean will be turned into a reserve with the dual function of protecting the whales and fighting the climate crisis. The move, hailed by scientists and conservationists, will help preserve the habitat of the fewer than 500 sperm whales that live in the water surrounding Dominica. By outlining an international shipping lane and allowing sustainable fishing, The reserve hopes to reduce deaths of the endangered species.
Government of Dominica has realized that the sperm whales, which were probably here before humans, are also citizens of Dominica. These whales spend most of the year offshore the island. So they are taking care of some of their citizens.
And that's our show. But before I leave you, the future of travel in New York may look a bit like this. The city exhibited its first ever air taxi flight in an urban setting. Responsible for this achievement is electric aircraft maker Joby Aviation. This vessel here can carry a pilot and 4 passengers. Joby is working with Delta Airlines to launch the service in New York, offering fast, emissions-free journey with little noise impact.